When you get an email back from a loved one and they say, you saved my wife's life or you saved my daughter's life. In other agencies and programs I worked at, it felt cliche, but I'll tell my staff, when you get that email or you get that phone call, you did. You saved that person's life, because if they would not have come here, statistically speaking, in a few weeks, they probably would have been dead.
Welcome to Beyond Theory, a podcast powered by Meadows Behavioral Healthcare that brings you in-depth conversations with firsthand insights from the people on the front lines of mental health and addiction recovery. I'm David Condos, and today's guest is the Executive Director of the Meadows Ranch, Mike Gurr. He joins me to discuss the life and death situations that women with eating disorders often face, and how his team helps patients and their families build a sustainable, healthy relationship with food. So let's get out of the abstract and see how this applies in the real world. It's time to go beyond theory.
So I'm Mike Gurr. I'm the Executive Director of the Meadows Ranch, and it's great to be here with you today.
Absolutely. Thank you for being with us, Mike.
Thank you.
Yeah, so let's start with kind of introducing yourself, your story, the journey you took to being in this work, getting started in this work.
Honestly, if you would have told me or asked me if I was going to work with eating disorders, I would have said no. How I really got involved was really working with adolescents in the beginning. I've always had a passion for families. I think families are the most important unit, right, in our society. So if I can strengthen and help strengthen those units, again, sign me up. So that's really where I began, even in this industry. So actually how I got down to the Meadows is I actually started working with all of our families. We have family workshops. Mm-hmm. So I did that for a little bit.
And that was at the ranch?
That was, actually at the ranch. And so that was nice because, again, I got to work with our patients, adolescents and adults, got to work with their loved ones, and very eye-opening for me, very powerful work. And then slowly I, became the clinical director and then the executive director. But so that's a very short version of how I got here.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And so to kind of give an introduction to the Meadows Ranch now, mm-hmm. Kind of describe what are the patients coming in with? Who are the patients? Kind of what's your approach?
Yeah. So the Meadows Ranch is an eating disorder program. We've got 44 beds on our property. We sit on 45 acres in the beautiful Sonoran Desert. We do both adolescents and adults, and we're all female. And so our adults, we can take obviously 18. The oldest patient I've had since I've been here is 73. The youngest patient that I've had has been 10, but we can take as young as 8. So really 8 to 17 years old, we can work with. Yeah.
And so when you're looking at a population that is 10-year-olds, is also people up to 70-year-old, I assume there are some similar threads going through mm-hmm. all of those people. But what are the differences? Like, are there some challenges or different ways that you approach different pieces?
So I'll talk about both, about the similarities and differences. So the similarities that we have found is we have done a lot of temperament testing with our patients. And so we'll use the Taylor-Johnson temperament assessment. But we also have a brain center, and in that brain center, we will do neurofeedback and initial assessment on all of our patients. And what we have found over the years is there really has become a profile for all of our patients, no matter if you're coming in with a diagnosis of anorexia, bulimia, binge eating. And what's, I think, cool about that is, our eating disorder patients will come in and they will compare themselves. And they will compare themselves and say, I'm either not sick enough to be here, or I'm not as bad as her, or I'm worse than her. And when they actually start finding out that the temperament or how they respond to stimuli in their life, how they do it is actually very similar, right? So whether I'm restricting food, doing the binge purge, or just binging, the reason I'm doing that is very similar. So that's a similar component regardless, right, across the board. And once they realize that, there's safety in that I'm surrounded by like-minded people who get it, who get my suffering, who get my struggle. Now, as far as the differences, obviously, how sick somebody is, how malnourished they are, can be very different as far as, what we're going to do with them, the type of work we can do with them, the depth of work we can do with them. So again, we'll have patients coming in as low as 70% of ideal body weight. We'll have some coming in, in the 90s. But I would say probably the hardest thing with eating disorders, as we just talked about, is the complexity. And it's the most complex mental illness out there. It has the highest mortality rate, anywhere between 9 to 12%. And so, our staff, as you're working with this kind of a patient, you actually understand that we're dealing with life and death. And, the cool thing and not the cool thing is, when you get an email back from a loved one and they say, you saved my wife's life, or you saved my daughter's life. In other agencies and programs I worked at, it felt cliche. I mean, maybe you did a little bit, but it kind of felt cliche. But I'll tell my staff, when you get that email or you get that phone call, you did. You saved that person's life, because if they would not have come here, it's very likely, and statistically speaking, in a few weeks, they probably would have been dead. So it's rewarding, but at the same time, an eating disorder will test everything you have as far as a therapist, a dietitian, a psychiatrist. So the work is not easy. But again, as we continue in patience and understanding and education, the results are amazing. Yeah. Now, I will say this, we're unique in that we have 3 different levels of care. So we have an inpatient hospital level. I've got a residential, and I've got a partial hospitalization. So we really, want to stabilize them. That's kind of how I conceptualize what we do, is at that highest level of care, we're stabilizing the patient medically, nutritionally, psychologically. At our residential, this is where we are going to start doing the work. Both in the eating disorder, the trauma, the substance, you name it, we're going to dive deeper there. And then our PHP is really application. So we have stabilized you, we've given you tools and skills, and now can you apply it? So we really hopefully get them to a point that when they leave us, that next team or that IOP, they're going to continue to maintain, those things that they've worked on and learned with us.
Yeah. And that's interesting how like the stabilization part is that it is such a life or death thing, like you were saying. I mean, you really have to work physically, medically with them before they're even ready to take that next step, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, if you come in so malnourished, like we'll have patients that will come in and you will have a conversation with them. The next day you will go in and they won't remember who you were. They don't remember the conversation because their brain is just so malnourished. They can't process, they can't retain, they can't hold anything. They're very much in a fog. So yeah, it's fascinating, what happens to the body when it is malnourished, but it's also rewarding when you see that nourishment take place. And we'll tell our patients in the beginning, the best medicine that you will have is food. And now the hard part about that is they view that as the enemy, obviously. Right. So, what do we do to help them, be able to have a relationship with something that they really are so afraid of? Right.
And so how do you help them kind of rewire the brain for that? Because it's, as opposed to, I'm sure you've heard this comparison before, as opposed to like alcoholism, right. You can't tell them just avoid food. Yeah, right. I mean, so how do you get that?
So we'll take there's a few things that we'll do. And 2 of them are I'd like to say cutting edge, or definitely makes us different as far as our treatment. So one is, as I mentioned before, our brain center. So in our brain center, all of our patients will go up and they'll have an initial assessment on our neurofeedback machine. On that machine, it will basically tell and give feedback on a screen of how their brain is functioning. We're able to tell if they've had any brain injuries, if they've had any concussions, and what we have found over time is that most of our eating disorder patients come in with low alpha, high beta, high theta. And what's interesting is that actually mimics or really parallels the temperament testing that we have done prior to having the brain center. And so the cool thing is they're able to see, okay, there's my brain. And initially they are unable to really hold any state of regulation. And, you know, if you could kind of picture the screen of what we really want all of these levels to look like layers of lasagna noodles.
Okay.
Nice and even. But when they come in, it's spiking all over the place because they can't regulate. Their mind is not calm. Their mind is in chaos. And
that's kind of what's fueling the disorder?
It's a big part, because what happens is now if I introduce them food, guess what happens? I become dysregulated, right? And so here comes the anxiety. Here comes just the flood of emotions, and I'm not going to eat. Here comes the fear. So I'm either not going to eat, or again, if I eat, then I feel terrible and I got to get rid of it, or I can't stop eating. So that kind of goes back, right? The similarity, whatever the eating disorder is that you're struggling with, it might be a different behavior, but the reason is very similar. They have really started to create these electrical networks, right? These pathways in their brain. So we want to be able to basically rewire that, right? Rewire that electric circuitry. And so through our neurofeedback and biofeedback, that's exactly what we're able to do. And it's a lot like, I'll tell people, if you were seeing yourself in a mirror, you're walking, you looked over and you saw yourself in a mirror, and you saw yourself kind of just hunched over a little bit. A lot of times, what would you do if you saw yourself?
Try to correct yourself.
Yeah. I'm kind of hunched over. I didn't realize that, and you would correct yourself. That's exactly what we are doing with our brains with the neurofeedback. Is they actually get to see this device. We get to really take what we need as far as the frequency where their brain needs to be, and based upon these games, these exercises, we train the brain to get there, and it gets rewarded when it does what it needs to do. So the cool thing is my brain center techs, they're saying, we're seeing results, changes in the brain in as little as 4 sessions. So when the patients start to experience a more sense of calm, when they can start sensing, holy cow, I'm not as agitated, or things are more clear, or I'm not in this fog, or I can relax. It's very empowering for them to be like, hey, guess what? It can be different, right? I don't have to be in this constant battle every single day. And as they learn that, I think the cool thing is they start having hope, because so many of these patients have lived with this and have fought this and are so tired of this, when they can actually experience what we'll call in our somatic experience, just one island at a time, right? I actually have experienced 2 minutes of calm. Never done that before. It's been a long time. Now they can build on that. And that's really what we do in the brain center. The other thing I was going to tell you about is we have what's called a Metabolic Cart. And the beautiful thing about that is that will actually tell our patients exactly what their body is doing with the food we are giving them. Because obviously what starts to happen is as we give them a meal plan, number one, they don't want it. And then number two, we actually will increase the meal plan as we go through that nutrition rehabilitation process.
You need to build them up physically.
Yeah. And so what'll happen is they won't trust our dietitians as to why you're doing this to me. It's too much. I feel full. I don't want to do it. And so with this Metabolic Cart, they're able to basically be in kind of this canopy, and in about 15 minutes, it's going to measure their metabolic rate. And not to get too complicated, but what it's basically going to tell them is that your body at rest, this is what it would need, just if you didn't do anything the whole day. If you just sat on the couch all day, this is what your body would need to do to function,
in terms of nutrition.
In terms of nutrition. The other thing it will do is as they actually start to intake food, it's going to show them what it's doing. What is my body doing with the carbs, with the protein, with the sugars? Because what will happen is if your body hasn't had food for a long time and all of a sudden you give it food, it doesn't believe you're going to do that. It doesn't believe that this is going to be a constant thing.
So it doesn't want to trust you because it
doesn't trust you.
It's been scarred.
Right.
Yeah.
And so your body will take it and you actually become hypermetabolic. It just goes fast, fast, fast. Therefore, that's where like, well, we need to increase your meal plan because your body is taking it and breaking it down. They don't even understand. Like, they're like, no, you're lying to me. That's not, I feel full. Now with this, we're going to be able to say, no, look, here's what's happening. This is why we're doing what we're doing. So that's going to be an amazing tool for how we treat, why we do what we do, to again help calm their anxiety and really help them stay in treatment longer, and to give them a better understanding, okay, this is what my body is doing. And so as we start to give them new experiences with our culinary education, with food, doing the work, the therapeutic work, the trauma work, doing the brain center, doing all of these things, truly, I think bottom line, we're trying to give them a new experience, rewire that brain. And hopefully as they leave here, again, I'm going to go back to that they leave here with hope. Because a lot of our patients come in and they feel very hopeless.
Yeah. And that's fascinating. As you're describing the metabolic cart, it kind of seems like that's almost parallel to like what you're saying in the brain centers. Like the brain center is showing them like scientifically, this is what's going on in your brain. And the metabolic cart is showing them scientifically, like this is why your body needs food. Right. And this is how much it needs of what.
Yeah. One thing with the metabolic cart, there's kind of this idea, this mantra is we're trying to heal you from the inside out. We want to show them what is happening internally, right? Because they're focused on what?
How they look.
I look fat. Yeah. Like they're focused outward. And really, this is another thing that this metabolic cart will do. It's going to say, no, we're going to transform you from the inside out. And so they're actually going to get that understanding of, holy cow, this is exactly what is happening on the inside.
Yeah. And so I know nutrition is a big part of this, and I've heard you talk about this before, and I think it's really cool how you involve the patients in that hands-on. Talk about why that's important and how you implement that into the program.
Yeah. So once you leave that inpatient level of care, because at that stage, like I said, it's about stabilization. So our kitchen is actually plating their food for them. All they need to worry about is obviously following the meal plan. But as soon as you hit our residential level of care, it's in a 2-story house. We have a beautiful big kitchen, huge kitchen, and they are the chefs. Our adults are preparing, cooking, cleaning, lunch, breakfast, dinner, everything. And so our dietitians do an amazing job. We have 16 culinary classes that they are educated on. They have to pass tests. So I think the importance of that, especially with our adults, is as they leave here, they're going to go back out into the real world. And this is where the idea is what's my relationship with food? And just 2 quick stories. One, we had a patient that was so fearful of food. I still remember the day she emailed her mom. And again, we wouldn't think this is a big deal, but she's like, Mom, I touched lettuce today. I made a sandwich today. Now, me and you would be like, so what? You made a sandwich, big deal. But for her, that was such a big deal because her distortion is even if I touch the food, I'm going to get calories. Just by touching the food, I'm going to get fat. So as we educated and again gave her a new experience, she was able to have a relationship with food. And kind of like you said, this isn't absolute. I have to have a relationship with food. I'm going to be around food every day.
So you have to break down that barrier one way or another.
Yeah. So that was a really, really cool story. The other one, we had a patient here and she actually came via The Doctors, and that's a show on CBS, and yeah, I think it's CBS. So actually I was on that show with her, and after she had left our program, they wanted to do a follow-up story. So she was with us for 90 plus days, and she was able to experience everything we could offer her, every modality, every ancillary modality. She got it all. And so we both went back out to Los Angeles. We were back on the show again. And they were asking her, okay, you've been at the Meadows Ranch for X amount of days. What was the biggest thing that you took away from your experience? Now, there's a lot of things that had happened to her, during her stay. And so in my mind, I'm like, okay, we're on national TV. Please don't say something that wasn't good. You know what I mean? Like she could have said anything. So I sat there with bated breath, and she sat there for a minute, and her response was, I was able to learn to live with the enemy. And she talked about being in the kitchen and being able to be around the food and handling it and cooking it. And I just thought that was interesting, that everything she had experienced, because like I said, she got everything. That was the one thing that stood out for her, because I think for her, that was so practical that, she had a little, I think it was a daughter who was 10, and she was going to go back. Right? I'm going to have to handle that food. I'm going to have to learn that again. So that was just a powerful, story in regards to this nutrition, piece that we have with our patients, that again, they are in the kitchen. Now with our adolescents, we understand they're going to go back and they're not going to be independent. They're still going to be at home. So what we'll do with our adolescents is they will be fixing lunch by themselves, right? With obviously help with our staff, but all the other meals we will plate for them. So we are giving them that experience. We are giving them the culinary education, but not to the extent of them becoming independent, because we know that as they go back home, mom and dad are still going to have, right, that influence. And that's where we need to help mom and dad learn what is your role. So they have that. It's still the big kitchen, but it's not as intense as it is with the adults.
Yeah, but it's still good to break down that fear barrier.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. So I know, like you're saying, education is a big part of this, but not just for the patient, for the family as well. I mean, especially for the adolescents who are going back home, but even for the adults who have, a spouse, a partner, children, whatever. How do you involve the family, kind of get them caught up on all of this from an education standpoint?
Great question, because as we know in any treatment, not just here, but any treatment, if that family hasn't changed, and our patients go back to that exact same environment, the likelihood of them relapsing is huge, right? So to me, family work is a critical component of what we're doing here. So a few things that we do, obviously, clinically, we'll have weekly Zoom sessions. So with our adolescents, that's a guaranteed given. Why I say it's not a guaranteed given is sometimes the adults, they will not sign a release of information. They don't want their family to know. They don't want them to be involved, or they don't want to do that work. So obviously, if we have that, we're going to include that with our adults. But with the adolescents, it's a done deal. They have a weekly family session. Where I would say also that we do, great work is that we have what's called a family week. So we'll have the patient and two loved ones. And typically that's obviously for adolescents, it's them and their mom and dad. For our adults, that could be, their husband. That could be a boyfriend. That could be their mom and dad. It might be a friend. And so whatever combination that support's going to be. And so what happens is we teach them very quickly what you think is the correct approach actually creates the opposite. That when you are just telling them, don't do this, do this, why are you doing this, stop doing this, it actually exacerbates the eating disorder, and you create the very thing that you are afraid of, right? And that kind of is mind-blowing to them, because once again, if you see somebody engaging in these life-threatening behaviors, well, stop it. Or eat, or and so that right off the bat, I think, is a big thing for them. It's just to understand really what is an eating disorder, understand why they're struggling with the eating disorder, and quite honestly, what do you do and what is your role? Very quickly, we fire them from being the police. We fire them from being the food police, and we teach them what does support look like? So in that family week, there's a lot of education. There's a lot of tools and skills we give them. We do the temperament assessment, like I told you. We do some personality testing. We do an emotional kind of growth. We call it truth and love, where we teach them how to express thoughts and emotions, how to hear those thoughts and emotions, which can be very difficult to hear sometimes. And then we actually talk about what are those wounds, what's happened within the family, how is this hurt, how have I hurt the relationship, and again we start asking for forgiveness. So that's a very powerful day. And then we end it really with, okay, what's the next step? What's your aftercare team going to look like? What is relapse prevention going to look like? We do some equine therapy, but that week is just such a life-altering week, both for the loved ones, but also for the patient. So those are really the two components that we look at when we look at the family involvement.
Yeah. And so kind of taking a step back and looking bigger picture now, what would be one thing that you wish the general public understood better about this? I know you've already talked about how you kind of educate the families, but looking at the general public, what's one thing you wish they understood?
Probably I would say this, that when you see the behavior, right, whatever compensatory behavior they're engaged in, whether that's restriction, whether that's overexercise, whether that's purging, whether that's binging, self-harm, whatever behavior they're engaged in, understand there's a function behind it. Meaning that when they engage in that behavior, to me, it's a sign of struggle. So as a loved one, as a husband, as a mom, as a dad, instead of me overreacting to the behavior and reacting in a fear-based way, which I understand, think of it as, okay, this behavior is showing to me that a person I care for and love is struggling. What would I do? How would I help somebody that's struggling? Right? I'm not going to berate them. I'm not going to yell at them. I'm not going to say, you need to stop doing that. And if I could help people understand that, then the approach, the compassion, the understanding, and really even the empathy, because I might not be able to get why are you doing that behavior, but because you're hurt, you're sad, you're in pain, I get those feelings and I can connect with you. So to me, eating disorders create such a disconnect in relationships.
Yeah. It can be hard to understand why that's happening.
Right. If I can teach you actually to connect in that exact same behavior, right? If I can teach a loved one, I can connect when you're doing that versus the approach of disconnecting. I think that would be a huge, huge piece in helping them in that struggle.
Yeah. What would be one kind of book or resource related to this that you would recommend to people?
I look at hundreds and hundreds of screens, right, every year of people that are looking to come to the Meadows Ranch. One question that we have on our screen, it talks about shame. And not to over-exaggerate it, but I would say 9 out of 10 screens that I see say, yes, we are experiencing extreme shame. So one of the highlights of eating disorders is just this utterly huge piece of shame. I'm not good enough. I'm not pretty enough. I'm not skinny enough. You name it, I'm not, you fill in the blank. So when you think about that, shame doesn't just disappear. Right. And I would like to teach them how to become more resilient to that, because you're going to get that probably every single day, whether I'm comparing myself to you, whether it's because there's a trigger with food or what somebody said, how to become more resilient to that. So a book that I like, it's called The Gifts of Imperfection by Brene Brown, Dr. Brene Brown. And and I think it does an amazing job of, hey, you know what? We don't have to be perfect. And I am enough. Right? I am okay just who I am. So if that's a message, right, that people can get, that, you know what, who I am, that's enough. I am enough. I'm value. I am worth it, whatever that message is. But especially with eating disorders, if they can gain some tools, some understanding, some self-compassion to help become more resilient to shame, awesome.
Yeah. And then to wrap up, what would be one piece of advice that you might give someone that has either meant a lot to you or that you find yourself giving that means a lot to others?
You can use this, I think, in anything. I know we're kind of talking about an eating disorder and recovery, but I use this with my kids. I mean, with everybody. And there's a phrase, by small and simple things, great things will come to pass. And as you do this work, it's just one step at a time. It's one little thing at a time. And if you keep doing those one little things, right, over and over, great things will happen. Recovery can happen. Change can happen. And so to me, it's just this principle of just line upon line. It's not all going to happen at once, but truly by small and simple things, great things can happen.
Mike Gurr serves as the executive director of the Meadows Ranch, an eating disorder treatment program for adolescent and adult women in Wickenburg, Arizona. You can find out more about Mike's team and what that program offers at meadowsranch.com. To check out more episodes of this podcast and to find all kinds of other resources and tools from Meadows Behavioral Healthcare, visit beyondtheorypodcast.com. Finally, thank you for listening, and I hope you'll join us again next time for another episode of Beyond Theory.